Good evening, Idamagogo. I have a special treat for a lot of you. We're going to be reading my piece from the anthology Black Seed, Not on Any Map, Indigenous Anarchy, a book that was recently published later last year. So let me just get into it. So the piece that I am reading to you is called Black Kitty Conspiracy for Another World, Deconstructing Anarchism, Settler Colonization, and Anti-Blackness. There is a glaring typo in the title, so it's damn, from jump. These folks were getting on me about spelling errors and all this stuff, and y'all get the title wrong. I cannot. Presentation for the 2015 annual Orange County Anarchist Book Fair with minor edits. So I was like, I ain't trying to do any more work. I'm just submitting something that I had already read and wrote at an anarchist book fair years ago. So I preface this writing by saying that knowledge can never truly be owned. Knowledge is a gift. Indigenous relationships with Earth have enabled me to trouble my own relationships to land, the collective, and knowledge because these concepts are decentralized. A parallel sense of belonging occurs between land theory and ism. When I gaze critically at my ability to name my theory after myself, call it an Edsyism. Am I caging and limiting this knowledge? Or can I name it something else that doesn't belong to me, but rather to a theory that others can belong to, or have to carry on, and can expand on critically, temporally, and spatially? Capitalism and Western philosophy does all it can to capture, commodify, and arrest these ideas. But what happens when our collective aim is to liberate them? I am an anti-authoritarian. I feel that anarchism is one of my first political philosophical loves, like a great romance with its ups, downs, confusion, with respect for its aims, symbology, and potential. I attribute some of my greatest critical understanding to anarchism and its many schools of thought, minus anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-Christianity. Given that anarchism may be a philosophy based within prefigurative politics or an anti-politic that aims to remove coercion and violence from every social relationship. So when the dominating genocidal narratives are Christianity and capitalism, church and state, I wonder what then are the ANCAPs and anarchists attempting to liberate themselves from. To resolve and organize pursuits without interference from the state and any imposed political economy, meaning a stateless society that isn't organized by the flow of capital and coercion, conformity of productivity, anarchism is an admirable endeavor. However, with much respect to my ancestors who have resisted the nomenclature of non-consensual Western dominance, white solipsism, political orthodoxy, and its Eurocentric canon, I have internal conflict with naming myself an anarchist. But my practices and organizing strategies could very well be named anarchism. Settler colonization as a name process tends to be a known misnomer because the name erases the actual invasion of land that was already inhabited. But as far as my personal invader decolonization is concerned, I aim to emancipate myself from this Western Eurocentric canon, which according to Akile Membe is a canon that attributes truth only to the Western ways of knowledge production. It is a canon that disregards other epistemic traditions. It is a canon that tries to portray colonialism as a normal form of social relations between human beings rather than a system of exploitation and oppression. It is a political motive on my end to refuse to take on the anarchist title. However, I still have respect for some who do use such a title, and accomplices and co-conspirators amongst those who may call themselves anarchists. I often side eye many self-proclaimed anarchists, though, because, like the term ally, it is often a false moniker. Possibly fueled by growing narcissistic individualism, it seems the anarchist, only in name and theory, really only wants the individual social cultural capital of the title without the work necessary to take up such a position that requires ongoing action. It becomes a self-interested pat on the back. In my understanding, collective perpetual reconciliation, initiative, and cooperation need to all be applied if we are to not get wrapped up in dogma, canon, or rugged competitive individualism. Anarchism, in all of its anti-capitalist and anti-state analysis and rhetoric, seems to fall short regarding focus invader decolonization and an actual constant vigilance towards unlearning the effects indoctrination and subordination under the state's rule. Along with countering the colonial project's hegemony, worldview, and values, there must be necessary re-indigenization that accounts for Black and Indigenous relationalities with the land, autonomous cultures of resistance, with domination removed and decentralization of power. To emphasize what Cydia Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, I quote Lawrence Ndua on Black resistance. Diasporic Black struggles, with some exceptions, do not tend to lament the loss of indigeneity and the trauma of being ripped away from the land that defines their very identities. From Indigenous perspectives, the true horror of slavery was that it has created generations of deculturalized Africans, denied knowledge of land, language, clan, family, and land base, denied even knowledge of who their nations are. This quote from me raises the question, when the key motive of anarchist belief is self-determination, how can there be a true, literal self-determination when the subject is thrust into the role of object and the object's self has been stripped away? I refer back to anti-authoritarian as my self-descriptor because, like queer or gender nonconformist, it is not only the antithesis of definition or anyone's stagnant, structured political identity, but it also opposes all etymologies of authority, categorization, or unquestionable invention, advice, opinion, influence, command, genre, control, master, leader, author. For who authorizes our every waking movement? Who has authored and written law and order that dictates our actions, thoughts, dreams, emotions, and coerces us to labor because of its economy of state-sanctioned violence and power? We truly live in the living dystopia because our material reality is designed by these written doctrines and the institutional languages of imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, ableist, cisnormative, heteropatriarchy. When we're regulated by written words and fantasy enforced by inherently violent institutions, claims of dystopian reality aren't only hyperbole. It is high time we tear at these pages whilst rejecting their symbolic order and never deferring to any canon. Do away with dogmatic scriptures that shape our materiality for us. We must heal our spirits from the disastrous effects of invader colonizations. Anarchists, socialists, and leftists alike tend to fall into the dogmatic trap of the times, and we forget that the static, unchanging written word is a tool dependent on its bearers all on its own. A power that has often legitimized and prolonged genocide and the history of the conquerors. It has privileged the civil and perpetuates that civilized primitive dichotomy. civilizations, Western binary and written language becomes simultaneous truth and servant to its own logic and reason. This is what some indigenous resistors and those who salvage their oral traditions through collective spoken word often mean when they say they are against all authority. The Industrial Revolution and every revolution since, and even before colonization, continues to own land, to claim authorship and authority over the earth, bodies, and all of what it creates, to bow to the will and supremacy of human need, its state borders and wants. It is not saving us. This Western human hubris socializes us to not relate to those who have a relationship with and or belong to the land, as well as stunts the growth of interdependent relations. Without disruption, it is a pre-written commoditized future we are seeing, and it is always bleak and always fascistic. I'd like to close with centering re-indigenization and opposition to anti-Blackness. It's important to note that we don't all have the same intergenerational trauma beneath long existing interlocking systems of domination. So the necessary motions it takes for true liberation per descriptive political category is not monolithic. For my last example, there are essential arguments linked to the radical Black tradition that finds fundamental flaws in appealing to Western civil society that has relied on subaltern categories to form itself. Flaws in engaging politically with established coercive power to rely on the ultimate demand for liberation. The construction of the so-called West colonial project known as civility continually assigns worth and value to their socially constructed identifiers such as Black or Blackness. And for these reasons, there is no other universal civil descriptor of Blackness that, as Wilderson has helped reveal, isn't synonymous with slave, non-human, or fungibility. The slave has been intentionally left out of the conversation of loss entirely because the slave hasn't ever been a subject for humanity. Some may argue that other peoples have existed as slaves, but the pervasive naming and authoring of Africans as Black or Negro by the so-called West language turn hegemony cannot historically articulate any distinctions between Blackness, death, or slavery since the civil pursuit and colonial point of contact. The designated slave, according to sanctions by civil society, suffers something far greater than just loss. The gratuitous violence inflicted upon the slave is so great and deemed deserved that the slave is not granted a social life. The slave suffers from complete removal from the conversations of humanhood, i.e. social death or absence from the selective compassion humanity has to offer. So arguments and efforts towards liberal humanism are ahistorical when taking into account the intergenerational experiences of the slave or the savage. The global construction of civil society has always been reliant upon master-slave power relations, and with a colonial determination, it has developed a collective worth for Blackness in the collective unconsciousness or libidinal economy of the world. Though this constructed anti-Blackness has existed before the 1492 U.S. colonial project, in order for this absence to be wholly accounted for, should that be the liberatory desire, the state's institutions, its organizational design based off these inherent exploits of master-slave relationality and authorization, this entire civil society has to fall. The Americas as a project has to end, and the world as we know it has to be destroyed. And maybe then Blackness and all the downtrodden socially constructed identities will have an opportunity for truer autonomy. After the fall, there is ample potential in this otherwise uncertainty. thank you for joining me for my reading. Like, comment, ask questions on any of the things that I said. I feel like, I had written that in a moment where I was reading a lot of, or stumbling upon a lot of Afro-pessimism, and I feel like the reason I took to or was able to understand Afro-pessimism was because I had been studying green anarchism and anarchist critiques of civil society and industrial civilization, and getting back to the land, and how environmental disaster is kind of like an impending doom back in 2012, 2013. So, when I came across Afro-pessimism, it was kind of like a whoa, this is for Black folks, and it's a lot. I feel like it's a little bit more bleak, and I feel like some of the figureheads of Afro-pessimism don't really have the there isn't a roadmap, or it does, using the lens, it does kind of help put into context the weight of anti-Blackness and Negrophobia. But again, it's it doesn't really give examples on how to unhinge society so much as the reasons why that's kind of necessary in terms of how do we end Black suffering and anti-Blackness and the genocide of Black people. But yeah, so good feels. Let me know if you all have any questions. Thank you so much for listening to my reading of my writing from the Black Seed book. Thanks.